and played with local rules. But in 1744, the first laws of cricket were published, and the game was on its way to being codified and standardized. And in this respect, it followed horse racing and boxing. Cricket became the third major commercial sport of the 18th century. And what these three sports had in common was aristocratic patronage and the opportunities that those exercises provided for gambling. Gambling was an 18th century craze and a marker of aristocratic status. Flamboyant, high-stake bets were a symbol of inexhaustible wealth and abundant leisure time. And, if you think about it, an agreed set of rules for boxing or horse racing or cricket meant that bets were struck on a mutually acceptable basis. Aristocratic patrons of the game would pit their team against that of another. And in order to strengthen their chances, they increasingly took to employing as servants men who were known for their prowess as cricketers. And this interplay between commercialism, gambling, and aristocratic patronage reached its height, its apogee, in 1787 with the formation of the Marylebone Cricket Club, the MCC. The club was an ultra-elite grouping. Its members were at the core of the oligarchy that ruled 18th century England. The political and the social power of the English aristocracy, together with the constitutional monarchy, was a central outcome of the 1688 settlement after the Civil War. And during the 18th century, the great aristocratic families invested profits from their land in canals, mines, merchant ventures, benefiting from the early years of the Industrial Revolution and the spread of British commerce elsewhere, especially India. They were men who took for granted their right to rule at home and abroad. They were bold, enterprising, and overwhelmingly confident. And it was in the last 30 years of the 18th century that cricket took on its early modern form, a recognizable form of cricket. In those decades, 1770 to 1800, the literary critic Raymond Williams has pointed out that the words industry, democracy, culture, and class were first used in their modern sense. Well, those same decades saw the first appearance in print of the words cricket field, cricket bat, cricket ball, cricket club, and cricketer. By 1800, the rules of the game had been standardized. There was a single body of control for the game, the MCC. There was a permanent urban showground, Lord's Field, and there was a small core of paid professional players. Cricket was the first team sport that spectators paid to watch. And by 1800, cricket was fundamentally the same wherever it was played across England. It had spread to almost every county. In the first half of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, driving urbanization, manufacturing, mass production, and imperial trade. I'm going to identify just two developments of the game in that period, the first half of the 19th century. Firstly, there was the dawn in the 1820s and 1830s of an extraordinarily influential ideology or set of beliefs attracted to cricket. Forgive me, you probably all know this, but when in England one speaks of public schools, one's speaking of highly private, selective, elite institutions. And public schools are very, very important to the history of cricket in England. Cricket was played at all the public schools, the schools which educated the sons of the ruling class, both the landed gentry and an emerging bourgeoisie. And it was at these schools that cricket was imbued with a set of moral, almost theological attributes. The game was seen as an exercise in character building. It was governed by a code of manliness and fair play. More than this, it was a preparation for life. And in the imperialist 19th century, this meant a preparation for the games of war and empire. André tomorrow will be talking about that in the South African context. The Times newspaper, commenting on the public school matches played at Lord's in the 1850s, declared in an editorial that it was, and I'm quoting, important to secure a race of young Englishmen who in days to come shall retain the grasp of England on the world, unquote. And that's actually linked to my second point about cricket in the early Victorian years, how deeply the game was shaped by social class, especially as expressed in the distinction between gentlemen and players. That had its origins in those teams put together by the aristocrats in the 18th century. Gentlemen were amateurs, lovers of the game. The players were men paid to play cricket. In the 19th century, that distinction was entrenched and formalized. The first gentlemen versus players match, and became an annual fixture, was held in 1806. Then in the 1840s, a man called William Clark assembled an All-England 11 comprised entirely of professionals, which toured, playing a series of games of teams in the northern counties. Other professional teams also emerged, and these were seen by the MCC members as a perversion of the natural order. By the 1860s, the MCC had reasserted its control over the game, essentially by denying those all-professional teams the right to play at Lord's or other major grounds. But I'm going to jump ahead now to the late 19th century, to the years 1870 to 1900. These are absolutely pivotal years for the history of sport, more broadly, not just for cricket. They saw in England an quite extraordinary transformation of organized sport. The first Open Golf Championship was played. The Football Association was founded in 1863 and the Football League in 1888. The Rugby Football Union was founded in 1871. The game of tennis was devised and the first Wimbledon Championships played in 1877. Something was happening. Sport was being transformed from a recreation with a small commercial fringe into popular mass spectator entertainment. And that change was driven by what was happening in society. There now existed an industrial, urban working class. Between 1871 and 1901, these years I'm talking about, the percentage of the English population living in urban centres rose from an already high 61 to 77%. Real wages grew, late 19th century, and so did leisure time. The Factory Acts had been passed, limiting the working day, and in, I can't remember, 1862, I think, there was the creation of the Saturday half day. People were only going to work half a day on Saturday. In other words, there was now a specific window available for major sporting events. Sport could now bank on attracting crowds on a regular and continuous basis. Leagues and championships were devised across all the sports to make competition more intense. The emergence of a mass circulating popular press was another key ingredient in making mass commercial spectator sport an absolutely key feature of late Victorian Britain. The MCC created the county championship and took over Test cricket, making Lord's the hub of the domestic and the Imperial game. Cricket entered the modern era with a strange social structure ruled by an aristocratic elite closely linked to the Conservative Party. The distinction between amateurs and professionals remained a bedrock. It was taken as a given that 11 of amateurs should remain in each team so as to provide moral and tactical leadership. That's a quote. While the professional, rather like a good butler, provided a skilled service but knew his place, essentially a servant or an employee. At test and county grounds, right across England, professionals used a separate entry to the ground. They dressed in separate changing rooms. They ate at separate lunch tables, and they addressed amateurs as sir. Amateurs were overwhelmingly batsmen. Most bowlers were professionals. In the 1880s, a further split opened up within cricket when the Lancashire Cricket League was formed, to be followed by other leagues all in the north of England. Their games were all played at weekends. The audience was overwhelmingly working class, and competition between neighbouring towns was intense. They were the forerunner of one-day games. Each league team could employ one or two, it changed over time, professional players. And over the years, a long list of top English and international players joined these leagues. The great Sydney Barnes. From the West Indies, Leary Constantine, George Headley, Everton Weekes, Wes Hall, and Michael Holding. And also Dick Abed, Basil D'Oliveira, Ghulam Abed, Seth Abrahams, Des February, and other black South African cricketers driven overseas by the limited opportunities at home. One of them, C.B. Buck Llewellyn, played in the Lancashire League for an astonishing 27 seasons after his career as a South African Test cricketer, and he was arguably the first player of colour to represent white South Africa. That's a separate story in itself. But cricket's profile and popularity in these closing decades of the 19th century owed a great deal to one single player who dominated the national summer game for 40 years in a way in which no other player had before or has ever done since. C.L.R. James, whom I talked about last night, located that player within this moment, this extraordinary moment of the expansion of organised sport spearheaded by Britain. And he wrote, and I'm quoting, "Sparking this great international movement, drawing all eyes to it, creating the myth and the legend, there began to loom the gigantic black-bearded figure of W.G. Grace." Now, in a game run by upper-class amateurs, Grace was an anomaly. He did not attend a public school. He was the fourth son of a country doctor, and his education ended when he was 14. He later qualified as a doctor, but his formal education ended when he was 14 and started playing regular cricket. He also fell notably short of the amateur ethical ideal, and you'll all know the stories of his sharp practice. Although the MCC elected him as a member, and so technically an amateur, playing every year for the gentlemen against the players, W.G. Grace was in fact the first great shamateur, sham amateur, earning far more in expenses than the salaries of the professionals. He was also probably the first sportsman in any sport to apply the work ethic to play, toiling long hours, practicing, playing, travelling, propelled by immense stamina and a terrible will to win. Grace, says the Dictionary of National Biography, was a quintessential Victorian in his commitment to work and play, his entrepreneurial approach to money-making, his self-assurance, his competitiveness, and his paternal authoritarianism. I like that sentence. But in 1895, W.G. Grace enjoyed a quite extraordinary Indian summer. He was 47 years old. He scored his 100th first-class century and went on later in the same month, May 1895, went on to score 1,000 first-class runs in the month of May, a feat equalled only by 7 batsmen in the history of cricket, most recently by Graham Hick. Public excitement was immense. On what other occasion, asked C.L.R. James, quote, was there ever such enthusiasm, such an unforced sense of community, of the universal merged in an individual? Scrutinize the list of popular celebrations, those not organized from above. I have heard of no other that approached this celebration of W.G.'s 100th century. If this is not social history, what is? Asked James. That remarkable summer, of course, took place in what is conventionally and nostalgically referred to as cricket's golden age, the years between the formation of the county championship in 1890 and August 1914. The game did have great players during these years: Grace, Trumper, C.B. Fry, Ranji, Wilfred Rhodes, a young Hobbs and a young Frank Woolley. But I think its reputation as golden owes more to its symbolism. Those long, hot summers of the Edwardian age, viewed in retrospect as an age of lost innocence before the carnage of the trenches. The game's golden age was a time of complacency, security, and opulent pride. The empire had expanded. Britain was a world power, and cricket came to symbolize the civilizing influence of the Englishman abroad. But complacency and security ended in August 1914. W.G. Grace wrote a rare letter to the press in which he called on cricketers, quote, come to the help of their country without delay in its hour of need, unquote. And the rush to join up was led by the sports-mad aristocracy. Britain lost nearly 750,000 men, a generation scythed down. And amongst them, the first to volunteer, the fittest physically, and the best educated. Public schools, Oxford and Cambridge, saw a phenomenal rate of volunteering. 1 in 5 of the public school and Oxbridge volunteers died. A higher proportion of officers than men were killed, and the most vulnerable category was junior officers, 35% of whom died. And almost all had recently been at public schools. The county championship was abandoned for the duration of the war. No test cricket was played until 1920. And like every other aspect of English national life, cricket took time to regain its strength. Before the First World War, England had won far more games than it lost. At home, had lost only 8 tests in 50 years. But in 1920-21, an English touring side was beaten 5-0 in Australia, and then in 1921, in the English summer, lost the return home series 3-0 to Warwick Armstrong's Australian tourists. Armstrong was a huge man. It was the ruthless Armstrong who was fielding at fine leg and picked up a newspaper at the Oval as it blew across the ground during this final game of the series. When asked what he was doing, he later told reporters, I wanted to see who we were playing. But the 1921 series was highly significant beyond that, beyond the defeat by Armstrong. and it shaped the course of international cricket up to and well beyond the Second World War, because it was the first time in cricket history that an international team used two express pace bowlers to open the attack. Gregory and MacDonald were used as shock troops, and the series has been, I think, correctly identified as the origins of the Bodyline crisis a decade later. Another feature of the Armstrong tour, directly reflecting the impact of the war, was that it exposed the pitiful inadequacies of what remained of the nation's amateur ranks. Not one of the 49 Test hundreds scored for England between December 1913 and June 1929 was made by an amateur. Now, this would hardly have mattered were it not for the dogged retention by the MCC of its insistence of having only amateurs captain the national team and all county sides. Famously, Lord Hawke, at Yorkshire's annual county dinner in 1924, cried out, "Pray heaven no professional may ever captain England." The MCC appointed various amateur captains to tours of South Africa, New Zealand, and the West Indies, the lesser opponents. Captain R.T. Staniforth had never even played county cricket. A.H.H. Gilligan's main claim to the game seems to have been that he was the brother of A.E.R. Gilligan, who had captained England 9 times, was incidentally a member of the British fascists for a while, and president of the MCC during the D'Oliveira affair, of which more later. He, A.H.H. Gilligan, and the Honourable F.S.G. Calthorpe only ever played in tests as captain. England did retain the Ashes in 1926, but this was sandwiched between 3 series drubbings, in the last 2 of which they first encountered the phenomenon that was Don Bradman and his inexhaustible appetite for runs. The stage was now set for the most controversial cricket series ever, the 1932-3 Bodyline tour, in which Douglas Jardine's battery of 4 fast bowlers exploited a packed leg-side field. The details are well known: the injuries, the hostility of the crowds, the diplomatic cables flying between the 2 countries, and Woodfull's, the Australian captain's, famous rebuke to the English manager who came to their dressing room. "I don't want to see you, Mr. Warner. There are 2 teams out there. One is trying to play cricket and the other is not." England won the Bodyline war, but they lost the peace. Persistent and systematic short-pitched bowling was outlawed. And after Jardine, in the next several tours, England's fast bowlers were instructed not to bowl short, which may explain why they lost home series to Australia and South Africa in 1934 and 1935, and away series in the West Indies and Australia in 34-5 and 36-7. So right through the interwar period, the game continued to be run by members of the political and social elite. MCC presidents held office for 1 year each, and between 1919 and 1939, only 6 were not aristocrats. Now that disgraceful half-dozen compensated for their inadequacy by including a Tory MP who went on to become governor of Bengal, the chairman of Midland Bank, the proprietor of the Times newspaper, and a baronet who became Lord Mayor of London. The decision-making body of the MCC was a 16-member committee elected each year. Of 67 men who served on the committee between the wars, all had been to public school, 23 to Eton alone. 20 were MPs, including the Prime Minister Baldwin, the Home Secretary, a Governor-General of Australia, and so on. Those who ran the county game had similar backgrounds which I think helps explain why they accepted the hegemony of the MCC. And yet, even while the amateur elite retained its grip on the administration of the game, on the field, professional cricketers made some significant advances during the interwar years. And of course, the professional ranks included some great players: batsmen Hobbs and Sutcliffe, Hammond, Woolley, Leyland and Hendren, bowlers Tate, Larwood, Vose and Verity, and two great wicket-keepers in Strudwick and Ames. And in 1926, for the first time, professionals were invited to share the same dressing room as the two amateurs in the team. The following season, two professionals, Hobbs and Rhodes, were co-opted as selectors, establishing a pattern. Match fees were increased, significantly increased, and top professionals were paid to promote suits, pens, furniture and cars. Some of them opened successful sports businesses. Now, these were the years, of course, that saw trade union membership double from 4 million to 8 million, saw the Labour Party displace the Liberals as one of two major parliamentary parties, and Britain's first Labour government took office in 1924. And I think that the growing confidence and standing of professional cricketers undoubtedly reflected those broader social changes. A cultural and social history of cricket in the interwar years reminds us that despite the social and political problems of these years, England was unlike Germany, Spain, France, and Italy, in that there was no major standoff between right-wing and left-wing forces. The crisis of the Great Depression in England was met by a coalition government. The Labour movement was reformist and supported parliamentary democracy. England eschewed extremism. It was an unequal society, largely at ease with itself, characterized by a degree of social harmony and cultural stability. Cricket reflected the essential inequalities and snobberies and the essential harmony of society. So that even while the game was riddled with privilege and social distinction, professional cricketers and the paying public by and large accepted that it was natural for the game to be controlled by those who exercised power in political and social life. In 1937, New Zealand toured England. England had just returned from the chastening loss of the Ashes in Australia. Bradman, captain for the first time, scored 810 runs at an average of 90. And he led the only team ever to win a series after being 2-0 down. And by then, 1937, most of the outstanding interwar professionals in England had retired. Two young English batsmen made their debut against a humdrum Kiwi side. One was Len Hutton. He scored 0 and 1 in his first test, but a century in the next, and 1 year later he scored 364 at the Oval when England registered their biggest ever win over Australia. The other debutant in 1937 had just turned 19, and in his only innings in that test he scored 65, and he was, fittingly enough, run out in terms of his later reputation as an appalling caller. He was, of course, Dennis Compton. Hutton and Compton represented the head and the heart, the north and the south of the Englishness of cricket. And they were in very different ways, which I will come back to later, they were pioneers of the game immediately after the Second World War. Test and county cricket was brought rudely to a halt in September 1939. And during the greatest war in history, a majority of Britons were thinking about the sort of society they wanted when it was all over. And in 1948, the electorate ditched Churchill and swept Attlee's Labour Party to power and welcomed the introduction of a welfare state. cricket also attempted to think about the future of the game. The Imperial Cricket Conference, really the MCC's colonial branch, drew up a 7-year program of international tours. Test matches by then had become essential to the game's economy. They paid for the game. English audiences, starved of the first-class game, enduring austerity and rationing, were fortunate in the fare served up after the war. Lindsay Hassett led a hugely popular Australian services team to England in 1945. In 1947, South Africa toured and were at the receiving end of Compton's summer. Compton scored over 750 runs in tests against the Springboks, and altogether an astounding 3,816 first-class runs in the season. And then, in 1948, crowds flocked in record attendances for test matches in England which have never been broken, as crowds went to watch every minute that they could of Don Bradman's Invincibles. Now, because football is so clearly the dominant sport, spectator sport in Britain since about the 1960s, it's easy to forget that in the immediate post-war years, cricket commanded more interest than football. In 1950, almost 2 million people watched county cricket. Test matches, especially against Australia, were the most important sporting events. Bradman's knighthood in 1948 not only honoured the great batsman, but also acknowledged the cultural importance of the game. To be made captain of the English cricket team was still the highest national sporting honour. And great batsmen had iconic status, none more so than Compton. Dennis Compton became the first cricketer ever to have an agent. He advertised sports goods, beer, and most famously, Brylcreem. He set in motion a phenomenon that would ultimately see its fullest expression in the modern franchised freelancer, the KPs of the game, the cricketer as brand. The timing was important. Compton's summer, 1947, was a ray of light piercing post-war austerity. As Neville Cardus wrote, there was no rationing in an innings by Compton. Then Hutton's pioneering role was arguably even more important. In 1952, he was appointed Captain of England, the first professional to hold that position. And for most observers, despite his use of negative tactics, Hutton's appointment was more than justified when his team won the Ashes in England in 1953 and then held them in Australia in 54-5. That was Frank Tyson's great tour, the key to that victory. The MCC bent its energies towards trying to keep amateurs in the game. Its official history explained that this was not for the sake of the old school tie, I'm quoting, but a sincere desire to regain and preserve the unfettered spirit of high adventure, the amateur's priceless contribution to cricket. However, this blinkered attachment to an imagined ideal had become an irrelevant and anachronistic relic. And in 1962, the distinction between gentlemen and players was abolished. The following year was famously described by Philip Larkin. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. And in the 1960s were, of course, as Larkin is alluding to, they were years of pop music, fashion, youth culture, and consumerism. 80% of British homes had television sets. The Mini and the Cortina brought cheap car ownership to the masses. social change accelerated. Abortion and homosexuality became legal. Capital punishment was abolished. Measures were taken to improve the position of women. More generally, the authority of age and experience were drastically weakened by an emphasis on youth and novelty. Old patterns of deference were under threat, symbolized by the takeoff of satire in the 1960s. The 1960s also marked a post-imperial moment. The independence of India and Pakistan was now followed by the end of colonial rule in the Caribbean and Africa. The Suez fiasco dealt a lasting blow to Britain's self-image as a world power. All in all, the 1960s tore apart a cultural continuity that had been largely intact since the late Victorian years. Now, how was cricket affected by such sweeping changes? The most obvious problem that the game faced in the 60s was a slump in the popularity of the first-class game. 2 million people, I told you, watched county cricket in 1950. That figure had halved by 1960, and by the end of the decade, 1969, was just under 300,000. County cricket had become a national monument rather than a popular modern attraction. It drew mainly the leisure classes and geriatrics to the games. Gates at Test cricket also fell. And in terms of public support and kind of popular fervour, cricket was eclipsed by football in the 1960s. Partly because soccer lent itself so well to television, and partly because of the frenzy that attached to the World Cup victory in 1966. Football replaced cricket as the national game, and not only because of the World Cup. Cricket no longer carried the same symbolic and cultural significance that it had previously. The game had been so deeply identified with the empire and the idea of the English gentleman that it suffered particularly from decolonization and the gradual change in national mood after Suez. The MCC was forced to respond to this slump in popularity, and it did so by finally accepting an alternative version of the game, a version long successful in Northern League cricket, a single innings, limited overs format, guaranteeing that the game would finish with the result in a single day. The first one-day competition, launched in 1963, was the Gillette Cup. And as the name indicates, the format brought commercial sponsorship into the game. Fans voted with their feet. The final that year was played at Lord's, and the Daily Mail's patriarchal Peter Wilson marvelled that the Temple of Tradition could be transformed into a reasonable replica of Wembley. He wrote, a sellout with rosettes, singing, cheers, jeers, and counter-jeers. This triumphant sport experiment may not have been cricket to the purists, but by golly, it was just the stuff the doctor ordered, unquote. A few years later, a Sunday league, sponsored by John Player, followed, and was also a financial success. The MCC now set up a Test and County Cricket Board, TCCB, as the new ruling body for the professional game, and a National Cricket Association for, all the rest. The MCC itself retained a diminished role as the lawmakers and the administrators at Lord's. And what took tentative shape in the 1960s provided the template for cricket in England for the rest of the 20th century. The first-class game subsidized by sponsorship income and television fees from various forms of the one-day game. These included the Benson and Hedges Cup and the Prudential Trophy, which in 1975 morphed. The Prudential Trophy was for one-day international games, and in 1975 morphed into the Prudential World Cup. So far as Test cricket was concerned, the overall narrative was one of English decline, as cricket slipped gently into self-parody and increasingly second-rank status in the rest of the world. Although the decline was interrupted briefly in 1981, the summer of Botham's ashes, this proved a false dawn. English cricket in the 1980s and 1990s became a convenient metaphor for England's dwindling place in the scheme of things. When the thoughtful Mihir Bose watched the Indian military medium seamer Roger Binney rout England at Headingley in 1985, he wrote, I'm quoting, "I could feel the first stirrings of a profound realization of the state of English cricket and the shifting balance of world cricket." It wasn't just that India won that series 2-0, but also that it followed two successive 5-0 whitewashes at the hands of the West Indies and away losses in 1984 to both New Zealand and Pakistan. The empire bites back with a vengeance. By 1993, the malaise was even deeper. Mike Marcuse wrote his wonderful book, Anyone But England, Cricket and the National Malaise, during the 1993 Ashes series. England had in the previous 12 months been beaten by Pakistan, India and Sri Lanka, and they were now drubbed 4-1 by a lowly rated Australian team. And comparing the hapless manager and the captain, Taylor and Gooch, with the helpless Tory Prime Minister John Major became a media staple. England's performance in the series, an observer wrote, was resigned, exuding non-commitment, misfielding, hoping not expecting, a group of individuals each wanting to do well without common purpose. And Marcuse concluded that English cricket in the 1990s, defensive, pragmatic, losing, neatly mirrored the decline of Britain as an economic and political power. It also encapsulated the neurotic struggle to come to terms with that decline. England lost not only test matches, but also its historic place at the apex of how the game was run. The Imperial Cricket Conference, formed in 1909 at Abe Bailey's urging, in 1965 became the International Cricket Conference, and in 1989 the International Cricket Council. And in 1991, for the first time, the ICC's annual meeting was held outside England. And the MCC no longer automatically provided its chairman. In 1993, the election of West Indian batting great Clyde Walcott was symbolic of the changing balance of power in the world game. And chronologically, I've now reached the point where the history of English cricket intersects with last night's story of Indian cricket in the 1990s. The momentum, you'll remember, in the early 1990s was with Indian cricket. England expected to host the 1996 World Cup after a gentleman's agreement at the ICC. But India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka challenged that way of doing business, forced a vote. There took place a fractious 13-hour meeting at Lord's, and England eventually backed down and agreed that South Asia would host a second World Cup. This was the day, writes James Asthill, that power in cricket shifted irrevocably to the east. Now, meanwhile, and I mentioned this last night, the Indian economy was being drastically deregulated, liberalized, opened up, attracting foreign capital, masses of foreign capital, into the world's largest, fastest growing and least developed consumer market. And then in 1996, there was a seismic change in the broadcast media. The venerable state broadcaster, which made the SABC look like a spratty chicken, the venerable state broadcaster was stripped of its monopoly, and commercial, cable, and satellite television expanded exponentially. Now, half the households in the 1990s in India, half of the households owned a television set. That made it the world's largest television audience. And that made it the world's largest advertising market. And that was in a country where televised cricket was a national obsession. Put those four together, and what do you get? An almost limitless revenue from broadcast rights to cricket in India. The 1996 World Cup was a runaway financial success, and from then onwards, India's share of global cricket revenue increased year by year, and so did its political ambitions. By the early years of this century, the ICC, International Cricket Council, began resembling a subsidiary of the BCCI, the Board of Cricket Control in India. Exactly the relation, of course, that the ICC once had with the MCC. Because of the rocketing sums that Indian broadcasters would pay for rights, playing against India was now the biggest windfall in cricket. I remember Adam Gilchrist being interviewed in, I think, of 2007. He said, "We just seem to play against India all the time." By about 2000, the BCCI could count on enough votes at the ICC from the other southern members to get its way on almost any issue it cared about. And in particular, India could cherry-pick its opponents and more or less set the entire international cricket calendar. As the Australian cricket writer Gideon Haigh summed it up, this is more than a power shift. It is a change in the nature of power. Meanwhile, back in England, cricket strove to reinvent itself. The ECB replaced the TCCB and the National Cricket Association, creating a single body responsible for cricket at all levels. Its first chairman was Lord Maclaurin, a high-profile businessman. And his 1997 report saw the county championship restructured into two divisions, as it is now, with promotion and relegation. He also introduced central contracts for England's test players, making the team a permanent entity under a full-time head coach. And if you like your history with a side order of irony, consider this. The Ackfield report in 2002 focused on the domestic game, and it recommended, and the counties voted 17-7 in favour. It recommended an entirely new format. 20, each side batting and bowling for just 20 overs. 2020 cricket was trialled for the first time anywhere in England in 2003. The BCCI was initially lukewarm about this shortest form of the game, and when the first T20 World Cup took place in South Africa in 2007, the international T20 competition, India rather grudgingly agreed to attend. But in Durban, Yuvraj Singh hit Stuart Broad for 6 sixes in an over. And a week later, India won the final at the Wanderers, defeating the historic rivals Pakistan. And the huge Indian fan base immediately became T20 converts. And in the following year, the new format took on a new shape. Inspired by the American city franchise model, baseball, football, basketball, the owners of each team bid for players. The Indian Premier League was launched on a wave of quite frenzied excitement, glitz and glamour. After 3 seasons, the IPL earned $4 billion in revenue. A format devised by notoriously stodgy English cricket was now the most dynamic, most lucrative form of the game in India, sealing India's domination of the world game. History, as it tends to do, had once again invaded the pitch. Thank you very much. Thanks. Again, very open to questions, comments, disagreements.
An additional ingredient from the Indian success in 1996, of course, is gambling. The Indians are probably the biggest gamblers of cricket in the world. But just a few remarks going back a bit. You're talking about the fact that public schools in Britain play an enormous part of the world. And I don't think it's very different from the kind, André may touch on this later on, but how many of our better cricketers have come from the South African equivalent of public schools?
Very much so.
And I think a lot of that is that these schools, many of them have a tradition of boarding, which means they've got afternoons where they play a lot more cricket, and therefore it's natural. And they have got staff who are keen to impart knowledge of cricket to them.
Cricket's an expensive game, particularly for schools. You need a pitch, you need stumps, you need equipment, you need a groundsman, etc. So it's those schools that can afford it in particular that saw it flourish. In South Africa, as in the West Indies, as in Australia, and in India.
Now, I actually was in the UK. I was very lucky to go to a public school, and I was in the same house as Peter the Eighth Knight and his brother Donald.
Okay.
Quite a cricket tradition there. But I remember I went to several of the 1948 Australian games, and in those days, I was just sort of interested thinking, as a youngster, one would buy a scorecard, and it was a penny for a scorecard, which was printed on the ground. 3 hours later, you'd spend another penny when you buy an updated scorecard when you were sort of 12, 13 years old. The other thing that was on the scorecard, the professional players had their name and their initials afterwards, and the amateurs, the gentlemen, would be Mr.
Yeah. There was a famous incident when Titmus went out to bat and the broadcaster announced his name and they said, that was an error. It was not F.R. Titmus, but Titmus F.R. Yeah. Just if I could just go back to what you said about gambling and India. Of course, you're absolutely right. Cricket is gambled on insatiably in India, and the first cousin of gambling is corruption. And James Asthill's wonderful book about the rise of modern Indian cricket, I've just been looking for a subtitle, but it was last night's lecture, is something like Cricket and Corruption. Yeah. At the back.
I was very interested to hear you say that the professional game was going in the early 1800s. How did those guys earn a living?
How do they earn a living? Initially, the earliest professionals were paid employees of the aristocrats. They became professionals playing for the Earl of Winchester's team or Duke of Richmond's team. After that, they were playing in 1840s. There were enough of them around for Clark to form that first all-professional team, and they were playing for the gate. They were playing for the income of people who paid to come and watch them. That's where the money came from. Yeah, I actually don't know when that stopped being the case, but certainly in the 1920s, as I mentioned yesterday, the English professionals who were going out to India were earning cash when they would normally have been unemployed.